Hello everybody and welcome back to Creation Myths, where we refute creationist nonsense one myth at a time. Today's creation myth is a little bit of inside baseball compared to what we normally do here, but we've had a couple of more technical myths over the last couple weeks, so I figure we could do something a little bit lighter this time. And today we are going to talk about one of the most frequently abused quotes that creationists employ: if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong. Before we talk about the origins of this quote, how and why it is misused, and why that's wrong, we need to talk about what ENCODE is. Now, I've done a video on ENCODE before, but if you didn't watch that, the ENCODE project, that's ENCODE, short for Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, that is an ongoing effort to identify all of the functional elements in the human genome. And in 2012, they published their first kind of large-scale study, and they very provocatively claimed that more than 80% of the human genome is functional. And this, of course, set off waves through the biology community and also the creationist community, because they took this and said, one, this is what we expect based on a designer. You have lots of functional stuff in there, not much junk DNA. And two, evolution can't maintain that much functional stuff, therefore it must have been created. The major player we need to introduce for this specific argument is Dr. Dan غراور of the University of Houston. At the 2013 SMBE conference in Chicago, he gave an excellent talk on ENCODE and junk DNA. I know it was an excellent talk because coincidentally, I was at that talk in Chicago in 2013 as a graduate student, and it was in fact excellent. In this talk, he made a persuasive case that junk DNA does in fact exist, and ENCODE's findings have been overhyped. During this talk, he said, if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong, and that became the most famous thing to come out of this entire conference. In 2017, he published a paper on the same topic, an upper limit on the functional fraction of the human genome, in which he used a population genetics model and an evolutionary model to show that there is an upper limit on the amount of the genome, the fraction of the genome that could potentially be functional. Here is the main finding from this study. There was actually a correction published subsequently. This is the corrected version. And what you see in this table across the x-axis here is the functional fraction from 5% to 100%. And then you have the frequency of deleterious mutations from very infrequent to very frequent. And in the table, these numbers represent the number of offspring an individual would need to have in order to maintain a stable population, given the parameters of functional fraction and deleterious mutation rate, that is to say, harmful mutation rate. Any number above about 2, give or take, is pretty unrealistic here as a long-term average for reproductive output, because this table is for individuals, not couples. So if you want to know what each mating pair would need to generate, it's double. So what you can do basically is draw a little triangle over here and say, like, it's roughly a triangle, it's curved, but whatever, and say, like, okay, everything up in this corner, this little corner, that's okay. So you can have a low functional fraction and a slow deleterious mutation rate, but everything else totally inviable. Therefore, there is a low functional fraction in the human genome. That's what غراور was arguing in this 2017 paper. Now, the creationist argument goes like this. Creationists wrongly claim that ENCODE proved the human functional fraction, which I'll abbreviate as FF going forward, is greater than 80%. Now, this is wrong, and for why this is wrong, see my earlier video on ENCODE, which is linked down below with the references. Creationists go on, since evolutionary processes can't maintain such a high functional fraction, citing غراور's paper and mischaracterizing his statement from 2013, therefore, creationists claim, evolution is wrong. In short, creationists say, if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong. ENCODE is right, therefore, evolution is wrong. That's the creationist argument here in a nutshell. So, why are creationists wrong on this question? Well, first, they are misusing غراور's 2013 statement. This is a classic quote mine, by which I mean, let's take something out of context that when we snip it, we can make it seem helpful to our case and make it mean something that the original quote doesn't actually mean. غراور did not mean if ENCODE's most ambitious claims are correct, i.e. if the genome is 80% functional or more, then evolutionary theory is wrong. What he meant was that if ENCODE's most ambitious claims are correct, we need to rethink some of what we know about evolutionary processes, specifically things like mutational load and selection and how they relate to some biochemistry. So the first problem is that creationists are claiming غراور was making a sweeping statement about evolutionary theory writ large, and that is simply not the case. The second problem is that there is no conflict between a high functional fraction and evolutionary theory. We know this based on a very recent paper called Mutational Load and the Functional Fraction of the Human Genome, which is published earlier this year, which is to say earlier in 2020. I'm going to quote a bit from this paper to make sure the author's meaning is perfectly clear. Quote, in this article, we examine whether and how an analysis based on mutational load might set a limit on the functional fraction. Pretty direct in terms of relevance to this question. We find that the functional fraction is not very likely to be limited substantially by mutational load, and that any such limit, if it exists, depends strongly on the selection coefficients of new deleterious mutations. So here's the key difference in this study from غراور's 2017 study. Our approach is different from previous work that compared mean fitness at mutation selection equilibrium with the fitness of an individual who has no deleterious mutations. That's what غراور did. We show that such an individual is exceedingly unlikely to exist. The cool thing here is that this part of the model actually comports with experimental results. For example, one of my favorite studies is Springman et al. 2010. This is a study looking at how bacteriophages, viruses that infect bacteria, evolve under chemical mutagenesis. So you're treating them with chemicals to make them mutate faster. While extinction was expected in those populations, what the researchers actually found was that in general, the phages get worse as mutations accumulate, but you find consistently high fitness individuals in that population because as you explore lots of sequence space, you find high fitness genotypes and selection preserves those genotypes. And that actually matches the data from this paper. So this is actually figure 1 from the 2020 paper showing that exact dynamic. So how does this actually work? Well, what this model found was that if you have a higher functional fraction, if more of your genome is functional, then you have stronger selection, which makes sense. If you have more of your genome is selectively constrained, then more mutations are going to be subject to selection, and selection is going to work more on that genome. So here's table 1 from this 2020 paper. You have functional fraction ranging from 0.2, so very low, up to 1, that's 100% functional. And here S, that's just strength of selection. So you have very weak selection, you have stronger selection, all sites AA, that's to say all sites in the genome are amino acid encoding. So that's about as strong a selection as you can get. What they find here is that as you increase the functional fraction and increase the strength of selection, you increase the highest expected fitness in your population. That's not average fitness, that's highest fitness. That's the maximum you expect to find. That's not to say it's common. In fact, it's very uncommon, but you end up increasing that maximum. The authors summarize in the discussion, the per nucleotide rate of mutation and the total size of the human genome appear to be fairly well established. Fraction F of the human genome that is functional remains uncertain. We have shown that when considering a likely maximum realized fitness in a finite population, the limit to F is by no means low. In other words, mutational load does not limit functional fraction. غراور, 2017, is incorrect. Now here's the kicker. غراور agrees with those results. How do I know this? Because I emailed him and I asked. And here is what he said to me. I'm showing this with his permission. He wrote, my initial claim in an upper limit on the functional fraction of the human genome was that no more than 15% of the genome can be functional. About a year later, I got a letter from Benjamin Galeota-Sprung in which he pointed out an arithmetical error, which reduced the 15% to about 8%. An erratum was published, and by the way, I have that link down below. He later pointed out that my entire back-of-the-envelope calculation was based on the assumption that the genotype with the highest possible fitness is realizable, and that is only true if the population is infinite in size. I was a reviewer on their paper when it was submitted to GBE and have recommended publication as is. This is how science works when it works properly. At this point, it is agreed by all that mutational load may not tell us much about the fraction of the genome that is functional as long as we do not know the distribution of fitness reduction due to new mutations. And the emphasis there is mine pointing out some of the important parts. So what happened here is غراور published a paper in 2017, and some other people, Sprung, realized there were some problems with it. Along with a couple of other authors, he published basically a follow-up paper disputing those findings using what they claimed was a more realistic model, and showing with that model that no, there actually isn't a limit on the functional fraction that can be maintained. غراور was a reviewer on that Sprung paper and recommended publication as is with no revisions. And if you know anything about the peer review process or have ever been through the peer review process, you know how uncommon that is. So when غراور says this is how science works, when it works properly, what we mean is something was published that had a problem, got follow-up publications that correct those errors. Now, a quick addendum before we wrap this up. I want to just kick Discovery Institute for their usual BS. For those of you that don't know, Discovery Institute is a think tank that promotes intelligent design. A lot of what they do is making intelligent design seem like it's science when actually it's just a facade for biblical creationism. That's neither here nor there for this particular argument, but I just want to point that out. So they have spent basically since 2012 arguing that the ENCODE project is strong evidence for intelligent design. They say there's a high functional fraction, therefore the genome is designed. Well, now you've got this paper that refutes that, and their headline was this. Paper shows that mutational load arguments don't refute ENCODE. I'm sorry, what? That's what you're going to take away from this? That mutational load arguments don't refute ENCODE? What you're ignoring, Discovery Institute, is the obvious implication that a high functional fraction doesn't refute evolution, which, by the way, is what they've been claiming since 2012. So for those of you familiar with the Discovery Institute, this is typical of their conduct. This is just one more example of their dishonesty. So to summarize, غراور's statement, as mischaracterized by creationists, is wrong according to غراور. In light of Sprung 2020, غراور agrees that a high functional fraction is perfectly possible, and therefore, contra what creationists want to hear, evolution is perfectly compatible with a maximalist ENCODE claim, which, remember, is wrong according to ENCODE. See my other video on that topic. So, if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong. That is a creation myth. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy what we're doing here and want more creation science bashing content, please give me a like and a subscribe. And remember, as always, don't get fooled.